Melusine by Reid Chapter 20, The Wild Animal. Roger stood petrified, shocked to numbness by this sudden apparition, by the threat. Yet he was not surprised. This was what he had subconsciously known would be the end of it. Monsieur Serpe would shoot him. Now it would happen. His father tried to force Roger behind him, but it was as if he were fixed to the floor. He just stood there like a pillar, staring with wide-open eyes at this monster of a man. Serpe moved out of the doorway and stood half-crouched next to the window. His movements were heavy and deliberate, but the barrel of the rifle, aimed at Roger's father's chest, wavered with the shaking of his arms. The rat mouth opened, and a stream of what sounded like frenzied abuse poured out. Roger thought, "He's mad. He's a wild beast. He'll kill us both for being here, for seeing whatever it is we've seen." Roger's father stood perfectly still, as if any move of his might make the gun go off. After what seemed like hours of the barking French voice, the man stopped shouting, and the muzzle of the gun steadied. Somewhere during the harangue, the torch, hanging on the length of Roger's limp arm, had finally gone out, but there was still enough light from the window behind the man for him to aim and not miss. Roger shut his eyes. The gun went off with a deafening roar and banged off the stone walls, and seemed to hit the ears twice like blows. At the same instant, Roger turned inward toward his father and felt himself knocked to the ground. A heavy weight fell on top of him, which he knew was his father's body. Through the echo of the explosion, he heard other sounds, a gasping, choking, and then scraping, grunting sounds as if of a struggle. Roger hardly registered these noises. His ears were still ablaze from the gunshot, and his mind was wading through thick terror. His father lay on top of him. Dead. Was he dead? No, he wasn't dead. He was moving. Roger felt him move. That basic terror out of the way, the next worst thing was trying to breathe. The body on top of him was crushing him. He gave a heave, caught air into his lungs, and then felt his father put a hand over the top of his head. He knew then. The relief was like pain. His father hadn't been hit. He had knocked him down and fallen on top of him to shield him. He had knocked him down and fallen on him to shield him. Now both their faces were pressed to the floor. Roger rested his head free and raised his face a little. He did it to breathe better, not to look, but his eyes were drawn to the writhing silhouette in front of the window, and what he saw held him immobile. The man, Serpe, was struggling wildly. The gun was not in his hands anymore. He was using his hands to fight something that enveloped him, something that was wrapping itself around him. Roger didn't have to see the pale reflection of the moonlight on the sinuous scales to know, in a paralyzed instant, what it was, who it was. He began struggling in his turn. "Melusine!" he tried to cry out. Don't kill him!" His father's weight made the words emerge as all but soundless gasps. Nevertheless, suddenly there was a lightning movement, a falling away, and the man was free. For a second he stood at the window, his arms loose at his sides. Then his head dropped back, and for an instant Roger saw, etched in grays and blacks, the tortured face. The black mouth opened and gave out a howling cry. It had words, and the whole body arched backwards. Did something on the floor lift his feet to tip the balance? Could he otherwise have fallen back over the stone sill? Roger didn't know because he couldn't watch. He banged his face down again on the floor in his instinctive will not to see it happen, but he couldn't block his ears to the despairing cry that ended abruptly at ground level, nor the sibilant rustle across the boards that perhaps only Roger's ears could have detected. The police, fetched by Roger's father from the nearest town at 2 o'clock in the morning, didn't believe him at first. They didn't believe in the tunnel and the sealed tower and the coffin, let alone the dead man. But if they didn't believe this white-faced Englishman's story, perhaps there was something about the boy who was with him, standing pale and shaking, with a blood-stained handkerchief pressed to his nose, in the curve of his mother's arm, and the two bewildered young girls who had been got out of their beds because they couldn't be left alone. That convinced them that something had happened that required investigation. So they came back to the Chateau Bois Serpe, and there they found it was all true. There was no sleep for anyone that night except Polly, who kept dropping off when they stood where she stood or sat. The police examined the body at the base of the tower, and then went into the tower through the door on the second floor. Serpe alerted after all by the noise, must have left it unlocked, as he came with his rifle to see who had invaded his secret shrine. More men, including a police doctor and an officer who could speak reasonable English, were summoned on the car radio. Eventually they came. While Roger and his father were subjected to several hours of interrogation, other policemen were taking away Serpe's body and investigating the tunnel. They also opened the coffin. Roger didn't find this out for 2 days. The events of that night simply felled him. He slept heavily and fitfully through the next day. Every time he opened his eyes, he roused himself to call his mother, who was never far away. "Mum, where is she? Have you found her?" "Darling, don't worry about Melusine. I'm sure she's all right. Just go to sleep. You've had pills. Don't fight it. Sleep, rest. Please, my sweet, don't keep waking yourself up." He knew he'd had pills. It wasn't natural to have this heavy, dopey feeling, to have to fight one's way to the surface, to ask the essential questions. He fought against the drug, trying to sit up while his mother pressed him back. "But where is she? You must look for her. You don't understand. Oh, please find her." "We'll find her, I promise. Everyone's looking. Now go back to sleep." When he woke up properly, it was night again. He sat up and put his feet on the floor. They didn't meet the cold flags, but a soft carpet. He looked around. There was a nightlight in the room, something he hadn't needed for years. It showed him that he wasn't in his room, but the twins' room, and that his mother was asleep in the bed on the other little raised balcony. Actually, she was not properly in bed. She'd laid down fully dressed and just dropped off. He knew that if he made much noise, she would wake at once and look after him. He crept up very quietly. The carpet helped. There were none of his clothes around, only a dressing gown that he never wore. But he put it on now, and his slippers. He crept out of the room into the kitchen. He found some candles left from the night of the blackout, and took one in an ashtray and a box of matches outside with him. The night was still and moonlit. He went straight along to the window of the ogre's kitchen. It was pulled to, but he was able to open it. Without giving himself time to think, he climbed in. It was very dark. He lit his candle. Then he went to the long table and examined it for signs of recent use. Nothing. It had been totally cleared by the police, presumably. In fact, the whole grim place was tidier, if not cleaner, than he had ever seen it. His eyes went to the fireplace where the gun had stood. A shudder of a remembered fear ran coldly up and down his whole body. He spoke to himself. "It's over. He's dead. There are weird things in this world, but there are no ghosts." It wasn't hard to convince himself, because somehow the atmosphere in the kitchen had changed. Now it felt just hollow, as if all the bad feeling, as well as all the mess and clutter, had been taken out of it. He stood still, thinking. He'd answered the policeman's questions truthfully, but without volunteering any unnecessary information. He'd said he'd seen Serpe fall backwards through the window. The unspoken question was, why? They asked if the man had said anything that they had understood. Roger's father replied that he had caught some of the words he had shouted at them, but they hadn't made a lot of sense. Something about privacy and the word for daughter, or what sounded like it, had come out several times. He'd also thought he'd heard sacre, holy, and pure, and the rest was simply what sounded like swearing. "Has he fell, monsieur?" asked the officer. "He speaks something then?" "Yes," Roger's father said. "I did hear his words then, quite clearly." The officer pointed his pencil over his small notebook. "Well, monsieur?" He cried out, "Donnez-moi mes filets." "Donnez-moi mes filets." "You are sure he said these words?" "Yes, I'm sure, but you must understand, mes filets is for more than one daughter. It is how you say in the plural." "Yes, I know." "Also, what does it mean, give me my daughters?" Nobody had any solutions. The policeman asked a lot about where Roger and his father had been at the time, but although he had plenty to say on the subject of trespass, something he seemed to take very seriously, he didn't really suspect that either of them had anything to do with the fatal fall, because it was clear from the disturbed dust on the floorboards where Roger and his father had been lying. The police were puzzled about some other marks, but they didn't ask Roger about them. So he hadn't betrayed Melusine. He wished, in a way, they had asked him, so that he could have withstood their questioning and shielded her, because he knew perfectly well that she had saved them. She had stolen up to the tower in her snake form and launched herself at Serpais just as he was about to fire, spoiling his aim. They'd found the bullet mark in the wall a foot from where Roger's father had been standing. Then she had set upon him. Why had she never done that before? It would have been the obvious way of protecting herself, but he was her father. Perhaps it had taken a life or death situation to make her lose her sense of this taboo against hurting him. Whether she had been partly responsible for his actual death or not, what must she be feeling about it? Did she even know what had happened? If she didn't know, if she had no memory of the events, when she changed back into her normal self, why had she gone? He knew she had gone because otherwise his mother would have brought her to see him, to put his mind at rest. It was because he felt almost certain that she hadn't really gone far, that he had come to the kitchen. After all, where would she go? Where could she go? She must be in the chateau somewhere. He searched for her, high and low, throughout that vast, echoing, eerie place. He walked the corridors and open doors and shone his candle into nooks and cupboards and old chests. He walked the length of the great ballroom and opened the oak window seats. Every now and then he would call her in a low, imploring tone. Melusine! Melusine, come on, it's okay, it's me. The moon set, and only his candle, sinking into a pool of wax, lit his way. At last he came to the curved door where Melusine had struck down her arm. The door to the tower. Well, she wouldn't be there wherever she was, yet something drew him to look again at that upper room. He climbed the spiral stairs slowly. The candle was nearly burnt out, but then it was almost dawn. Through the arrow slit he could see the sky graying in the east, and a cool, clean wind ruffled his hair as he passed. The door to the upper room was ajar. It was empty. The trestles, the coffin, the tall church candlesticks, the veiling were all removed. Even the churchy smell was blowing away. Only a single small wreath had been overlooked. It lay just where the coffin had been. Roger walked over and crouched on his heels to look at it, the only relic of Monsieur Serpais' mysterious shrine. A faint perfume came up from the flowers. Surprised, he touched them. They were not artificial like the others. They were fresh. Nor was this little offering anything like the big garish funeral wreaths that had surrounded the coffin. It was simply a circlet of wild flowers, woven in a base made of... Roger stood up suddenly. He knew where she was. His abrupt movement flooded the candle flame with liquid wax and extinguished it, but he didn't care. Dawn light was coming through the window now. He started out of the room. As he went, he trod on something dry that crackled under his bedroom slipper. He stopped and touched it. Then he laid down the ashtray with the dead candle in it and felt around on the floor. There was more of the crackly stuff. He lifted a section of it. It trailed from his hand, something long and crisp and empty. He carried it through the window through which the man had fallen. It was quite perfect in its way, a tube of scales, torn only here and there, a beautiful transparent thing, a shadow of a snake. Roger examined it as much as he could in the poor light. He wanted very much to keep it, but he knew he mustn't. Someone might see it, might ask, might put pressure on him. He rolled the shed skin up carefully and carried it with him outdoors. On his way around the building to the goat pens, through growing daylight, he looked for a place to hide the snake skin, where it would never be found. He passed the big dung heap where the stable straw was shoveled. He found a stick and dug a hole and buried the shed snakeskin in the hot interior of the pile, where it would quickly rot away. He felt an immense relief, as if something bewildering and terrible had gone forever. And that's the end of chapter 20.